Lady Margaret Douglas, later Countess of Lennox, was King Henry VIII's niece, and she appears to have had rather an independent spirit, which led to her being involved in a number of scandals during her life. Scandals that even led to her imprisonment and the deaths of people she loved. Margaret was born in 1515 and was the daughter of King Henry VIII's eldest sister, Margaret Tudor, who'd married King James IV of Scotland. However, Margaret Douglas was the offspring of Margaret Tudor's second marriage, and her father was Archibald Douglas, 6th Earl of Angus. After spending her early years with her father, by the 1530s, Margaret Douglas was serving her cousin, Princess Mary, the future Mary I. Then she moved into the household of Henry VIII's second wife, Queen Anne Boleyn. Margaret was described by a French ambassador as beautiful and highly esteemed, and she became a favourite at court. She soon fell in love with one of the Queen's uncles, Lord Thomas Howard, half-brother of Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk. And in early 1536, the couple became secretly engaged. This caused a scandal. Margaret was of royal blood and was expected to marry a man of the king's choosing. Henry VIII's daughters had both been made illegitimate, so Margaret had a good claim to the throne. So King Henry VIII was convinced that Lord Thomas Howard was marrying Margaret with a view to the throne. He threw Margaret and Thomas in the Tower of London, and Thomas was attainted and sentenced to death. Margaret became ill and so was transferred to Sion Abbey until she was finally given her freedom on the 29th of October 1537. Sadly, her former sweetheart never left the Tower, dying there on the 31st of October, just 2 days after Margaret had been granted her freedom. He died knowing that Margaret had renounced her love for him. The same act that had attainted Lord Thomas Howard forbade the marriage of any member of the king's family without his permission. And you'd think that Margaret would have taken note of that and learnt from her imprisonment. But no. I guess love makes fools of us all. Margaret had been restored to favour and served Henry VIII's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, and was then appointed to serve his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. It was while she was in Catherine's household that Margaret fell in love with another Howard man, this time the Queen's brother, Charles. As soon as the king found out about the relationship, he sent his niece back to Sion. She also spent time confined at Kenninghall in Norfolk. During her confinement, Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, had words with the spirited young woman, warning her to beware the third time. Margaret behaved and was back at court in time to serve as a bridesmaid at the king's wedding to his sixth and final bride, Catherine Parr. In 1544, Margaret married Matthew Stewart, Earl of Lennox, an influential Scottish nobleman who'd allied himself with Margaret's father, the Earl of Angus, and other men who supported Henry VIII's plans to marry his son, the future Edward VI, to Mary, Queen of Scots. It may have been an arranged marriage between Margaret and Lennox, but the couple had also fallen in love with each other, so Margaret was finally happy. Their first child, a son, died in infancy in 1545, but their second child, Henry Lord Darnley, who was born in 1545, survived childhood. In January 1547, just days before Henry VIII's death, he and Margaret had an argument concerning her Catholic faith, and he removed her from the succession, favouring his sister Mary's Brandon Grey line. Margaret survived her Protestant cousin Edward VI's reign by keeping very much to her own household. But she returned to court in her cousin Mary I's reign, and it even appeared, when Elizabeth was out of favour with Mary, that Mary might just choose Margaret as her successor. However, Mary chose Elizabeth to succeed her, and Elizabeth became queen in 1558. It was in Elizabeth I's reign that Margaret became embroiled in a scandal once more. She'd always been keen for her son Lord Darnley to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, daughter of Margaret's half-brother, King James V of Scotland. And when Mary's first husband, Francis II of France, died and Mary returned to Scotland in 1561, Margaret began speaking openly about the couple marrying. Not only that, she unwisely spoke of how they could also lay claim to the English throne. When Elizabeth I heard of this, she threw Margaret's husband into the Tower, and Margaret and her children were confined to house arrest. The family was soon released, though, and Margaret was back at the English royal court in the summer of 1564. That autumn, Margaret's husband Lennox was allowed to travel to Scotland and was restored to his lands. And in January 1565, the couple's eldest son Darnley was given permission to join his father in Scotland. Darnley soon presented himself to the Scottish Queen, who quickly fell under his spell and announced their betrothal. As soon as Elizabeth I heard the news, she ordered both Lennox and Darnley back to England, and when they refused, she threw Margaret into the Tower. Despite his mother's imprisonment and the seizure of his father's property and belongings, Darnley married Mary on the 29th of July 1565. Mary and Darnley weren't happy for long, and Darnley was involved in the murder of Mary's secretary, David Rizzio, in March 1566. And in February 1567, Darnley was himself murdered on the night of the 9th and 10th February. On the 19th of February, Mildred Cecil, wife of William Cecil, Elizabeth I's chief advisor, and Lady Howard, wife of William Howard, was sent to the Tower to inform Margaret of her son's assassination. Unfortunately, for a short time, she was led to believe that her husband had also been killed. So distraught was Margaret that royal physicians were sent to her. She was eventually released. Margaret's husband acted as regent for their young grandson, King James VI, for a time, but he was sadly killed in September 1571. Margaret was soon in trouble again when she and Bess of Hardwicke, Lady Shrewsbury, arranged the marriage of Margaret's other son Charles and Lady Shrewsbury's daughter Elizabeth Cavendish without the Queen's permission. Both women were sent to the Tower for a time. When Margaret was released, she went to live with Charles and Elizabeth, who'd had a daughter, Arbella or Arabella, in 1575. Margaret died on the 9th of March 1578, and scandal even surrounded her in death. It was rumoured that she'd been poisoned 2 days earlier when she'd entertained the Queen's favourite, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. However, Margaret had been ill for some time. Margaret's granddaughter, Arbella Stuart, appears to have inherited her grandmother's independent spirit and penchant for scandal, for she married William Seymour, Lord Beauchamp, in 1610 in secret, an act that led to them being imprisoned. The couple hatched an escape plan, and although Seymour escaped, Arbella was captured and thrown in the Tower of London. She died there in 1615. I feel that Arbella was very much like her grandmother. What do you think?